The air inside Avalon Suites shimmered with luxury. Crystal chandeliers bathed the marble floors in golden light, and the scent of jasmine-laced polish clung to every surface. A doorman dressed in midnight blue uniform stood tall, chest puffed, as sleek black cars rolled up the circular driveway. It was the kind of place where money wasn't shown. It was understood. Then he walked in. Slowly, carefully, an elderly black man stepped through the revolving glass door. His coat was wrinkled. The duffel bag slung across his shoulder looked battered, the canvas faded by time. His shoes, although clean, carried the wear of decades. His gait was steady, but anyone watching would assume he didn't belong. He paused, at the edge of the lobby, taking in the towering columns and floor-to-ceiling windows. The hotel bustled with executives, fashion elites, and out-of-town investors. Conversations were hushed, controlled. Everything here whispered status. The front desk manager, Melissa Hartley, glanced up from her screen and instantly spotted him. Her expression faltered. The smile she had just given a foreign diplomat vanished, replaced with a brittle smirk. The man approached, nodding politely. "Good afternoon," he said, voice deep but warm. "I have a reservation. Daniel Fulton." Melissa's eyes flicked, from his face to his coat, then to the bag at his side. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. She gave a mechanical nod and began typing. "I'll need identification and a credit card," she said, voice clipped, not looking at him. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his coat, pulling out a worn leather wallet. From it, he withdrew a driver's license and a card so dark it absorbed light. Solid black, matte finish, no numbers on the front. He placed them both on the counter gently. Melissa picked up the ID, narrowed her eyes, then turned her attention to the card. Her eyebrows lifted. The corner of her mouth curled upward in a half-laugh, barely contained. "This is interesting," she said, holding the card between two fingers. "We don't take prepaid cards for suite bookings, sir." Her voice rose just enough to be heard by the guests waiting in line behind him. A chuckle escaped from a man in a blazer behind Daniel. A woman in heels leaned toward her friend and whispered something. Melissa didn't care. She was enjoying the attention. "I assure you, the card is valid," Daniel said calmly. Melissa's laugh was sharp. "I've seen a lot of these," she replied. "It's not a real centurion. Looks custom. Decorative, maybe." A young man at the next counter leaned over and muttered under his breath. "Is he lost?" 23-year-old Nina Carr, standing nearby with a hotel-issued iPad, froze. Her eyes darted to Melissa, then to Daniel. She had only been interning here for 6 weeks, but something about this scene felt wrong. It wasn't just the tone, it was the tension underneath it. She stepped forward slightly, as if her body might silently object. Daniel didn't flinch. His face remained unreadable, almost serene. "You're welcome to run it," he said. Melissa didn't move. Instead, she placed the card back on the counter with 2 fingers, as though it might leave a stain on her manicure. "I think I'll get my supervisor," she said, voice saccharine. "Just in case." Daniel slowly picked up his ID and card. He nodded once, not to her, but to himself. "No need," he replied. "I won't be staying." He turned and walked away, without another word. Melissa stared after him, momentarily puzzled, as if she expected some sort of protest. But Daniel didn't look back. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valet circle. Daniel stepped beyond the granite steps, pulled out a small phone, old, not flashy, not smart, and pressed a single button. The line picked up immediately. "It's me," Daniel said softly. "Avalon Suites, downtown, execute. There was no response. None was needed. He ended the call, returned the phone to his pocket, and walked across the street. His pace remained slow, his posture upright. Back inside, something shifted. First, the front desk lights flickered. Melissa frowned, tapping her screen. The reservation system froze. Every guest profile disappeared from her monitor. Room access codes invalidated. Internal servers locked her out. Phones began ringing from various departments. The security desk scrambled as elevators stalled, key cards failed, and VIP bookings dropped to unconfirmed status. Within 5 minutes, the general manager's voice rang out from behind the check-in wall. Everyone, pause all check-ins. We've just received a system-wide freeze order from HQ. All operations are suspended until further notice. Melissa blinked. What? Why? The manager didn't answer. He was on his second phone call, sweat forming at his temples. Nina looked down at her own device. A corporate-wide alert had just appeared. Immediate lockdown of Avalon Suites requested by primary shareholder. No override. No exception. Her breath caught. She searched the system for the shareholder ID attached to the order. It read, D. Fulton Holdings. She glanced toward the glass doors, but Daniel was already gone. The man they'd laughed at had just pressed a button and stopped the entire hotel from breathing, and no one had even bothered to ask who he was. Snow flurried gently across the outskirts of Austin, blanketing the streets in quiet elegance. In the dim glow of early evening, Daniel sat in a modest single-story brick home tucked behind a row of tall oaks. The windows were frosted at the edges, the fireplace crackled softly, and the room held an unmistakable scent of aged leather, cedar, and thyme. He poured hot tea into a chipped porcelain cup. No television hummed in the background. No music filled the silence. Only the rhythmic ticking of a vintage wall clock kept pace with his thoughts. Stacks of aged newspapers sat neatly in the corner, beside rows of hardcover books, economics, history, behavioral psychology. Beside them stood an old mop handle, worn at the grip, leaning like a relic from a life long buried. Daniel sat in a deep brown chair, faded by sun and memory, his fingers carefully turning the pages of a leather-bound journal. The paper was ivory and coarse. Each page held neat lines of handwritten entries stretching back decades. No title on the cover. Just initials pressed faintly into the leather. DF. He paused, pen in hand, and wrote slowly. Some fortunes are built from force, others from silence. Mine came from listening when they thought I couldn't hear. A soft knock at the door interrupted the quiet. He closed the journal, rose with a slow grace, and answered it without haste. Vivian Clark stood on the porch, her coat dusted with white, briefcase tucked neatly under her arm. Her heels made no sound on the porch floor. Sharp-eyed and precise, she had the air of someone who never had to say a word twice. You set things in motion, she said as she stepped inside. Daniel offered no reply. He simply gestured toward the armchair by the fire. She removed her gloves, placed her briefcase on the ottoman, and opened it without drama. You've already triggered full compliance, she said. I received a cascade of alerts. Asset refreeze on Avalon Holdings. Emergency protocol on Fulton Group's real estate portfolio. All subsidiaries notified. You now have personal control of 71 properties across 6 states. Daniel nodded once. What about the press? Nothing has leaked, she answered. But corporate boards are scrambling. Avalon's boardroom just had an emergency session. Your silence terrifies them more than any speech ever could." He gave a faint smile, one corner of his mouth lifting. "You know, I used to mop floors at one of their buildings. Downtown Dallas, 1972. They had a strict backdoor entrance policy for janitorial staff. I used to enter through the alley, pushing a metal cart, listening to men in suits shout about mergers while I swept near the elevators." Vivian closed the briefcase, her gaze steady. "You own the building now." Daniel sat back down and picked up his tea. They never looked twice. "And that gave me time to learn." He stared into the fire. Flames licked the wood slowly, like dancers rehearsing a familiar rhythm. "I learned their language, their habits. I noticed patterns, how contracts were written, how money flowed through silent channels. No one pays attention to the man pushing the mop. But I was watching everything." Vivian's voice was softer now. "You turned a janitor's wages into your first stock buy-in. I bought 10 shares of a cleaning supply company. Used a broker who didn't even ask my name properly. In a year, those shares doubled. Then I bought vending machines. Then I invested in warehouses that stored them." He sipped the tea again. "By the mid-'80s, I had real estate in 4 cities and shares in 2 regional banks. And I still worked nights, just so no one would see the truth too early." Vivian sat forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "They say silence is weakness," she said. "You turned it into an empire." "I never needed applause. I needed leverage," he replied. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice and fell silent. The night resumed its stillness. "You're not angry about today," Vivian observed. Daniel looked over at her. "No," he said quietly. "They acted exactly how I expected. Melissa, that young man at the desk, they played their parts perfectly." He opened his journal again, flipping back a few pages. It was never about humiliation. It was about exposure. They revealed themselves. Not me. Vivian stood and adjusted her coat. "They'll try to recover, make excuses. You embarrassed a billion-dollar operation without raising your voice." Daniel placed the journal on the table beside his chair. "They've made it clear that appearance matters more than substance. That's their blind spot. Always has been." She reached the door, pausing before stepping into the cold. "They'll come after you next. Try to undermine your holdings, deny your stake, rewrite the narrative." Daniel leaned his head back against the chair. "Let them," he said, eyes closed. "I'm done hiding." The door shut quietly behind her. Daniel sat alone once more, the fire now a glowing ember bed. He looked out the window at the snow falling, thicker now, covering sidewalks and streetlights in white. Then, with steady hands, he reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out a velvet-lined box. Inside lay a ring, platinum, inset with onyx, engraved with a symbol nearly erased by time. The original seal of the first company he ever acquired, Fulton Industrial Care. He turned it between his fingers. They had laughed at the old man with a faded bag. They would not be laughing for long. Nina Carr sat cross-legged on her narrow dorm bed, the glow from her laptop illuminating her determined face. Her fingers tapped quickly across the keyboard, searching names, filtering through digital footprints, and cross-referencing property ownership databases. She had watched the man everyone dismissed earlier at Avalon Suites walk out with a calm that chilled her. Then the entire building system had collapsed. Nobody could explain it. Phones rang off the hook. Managers whispered in hallways. Corporate protocols locked down operations. But her instinct said the answer stood quietly, in a worn coat, and walked without needing permission. She typed Daniel Fulton into a lesser-known business registry database. A dozen obscure shell companies appeared. She clicked through each. Most were generic on the surface, but when she mapped the registered addresses and compared them to known hotel holdings, a strange pattern formed. One by one, properties linked. To Avalon Suites' parent company traced back to those hidden shells, and every one of those shells listed a matching contact ID. D. Fulton Holdings. Her breath caught. He wasn't a victim of mistaken identity. He was the architect. She leaned back, eyes wide. The man the front desk laughed at had orchestrated the collapse from the inside. Miles away, on the 20th floor of a steel and glass tower downtown, Cameron Voss adjusted his tie before stepping into the boardroom. Tall, sharp-featured, with a smirk that rarely left his face, he exuded entitlement. Board members gathered, murmuring under their breath, unsettled by the earlier lockdown. Cameron waved his hand as though brushing off dust. "The incident at Avalon is being exaggerated," he said, addressing the room. "We'll spin it as a system error and issue a temporary apology. Nothing that warrants concern." The chairman, a stiff man named Ellis Breyer, frowned. "You're suggesting we dismiss the shutdown of our flagship property as technical failure? That won't hold if shareholders ask questions," Cameron smiled. "Leave the narrative to me. I've scheduled a press touch point. We'll present it as a cyber glitch and cite a non-existent internal audit." A woman seated at the end of the table adjusted her glasses. Leora Quinn, his executive assistant, had remained silent throughout. She always did. But her expression this time was different. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. "Sir, the lockdown command came from the top shareholder authentication code. That doesn't align with a glitch." Cameron's eyes narrowed slightly. "You've been digging, Ms. Quinn?" "I review every financial flag that crosses the internal channel." He leaned forward. "Then I'd advise you to remember who you work for." She held his gaze, her voice calm. "And I'd advise you to consider who owns the roof we're sitting under." After the meeting ended, Leora returned to her office, heart racing. She closed the blinds, inserted a tiny voice recorder from her purse into a locked drawer, and opened a hidden folder on her tablet. Inside were months of notes, transcripts, and recorded statements. Cameron had been orchestrating a push to remove the silent majority holder from Avalon's parent company by gradually dissolving older board protections. She knew now that the owner he was trying to erase was Daniel Fulton. She wasn't alone in uncovering truth. Nina, unaware of Leora's efforts, typed a final name into her database, Vivian Clark. The connection was faint, but traceable. Vivian's name appeared in small filings tied to discrete asset transfers and litigation protections on behalf of Fulton entities. Nina clicked deeper, her eyes widening. The woman who had visited the hotel once years ago under the name of corporate risk consultant had quietly filed 9 emergency motions last year securing ownership protections across hospitality investments. It wasn't just coincidence. Something had been building for years. She switched tabs and began drafting a message to her anonymous blog. Title: "The Ghost Who Owned the Building." She knew she was risking her internship, possibly her entire future, but silence felt heavier than fear. Meanwhile, in the penthouse suite of a private investment firm on the edge of the city, Vivian sat across from a senior analyst with a stern expression. "They're accelerating," the analyst said. "Cameron's now leveraging outside equity firms. If he succeeds, he'll liquidate legacy holdings, including yours." Vivian nodded once. "That's why we're not going to let him." The analyst hesitated. "Are you sure Mr. Fulton's ready for a public confrontation?" Vivian's response was immediate. He didn't start this war, but he's going to finish it. In an upscale rooftop bar elsewhere in the city, Cameron swirled scotch in a glass while laughing with 3 executives. "They're scared of shadows," he sneered. Fulton was just a quiet investor, harmless. We scrub his name from a few files, install a new executive chair, and no one will notice. His words were casual, but Leora, sitting at the far end of the lounge on her own time, had heard everything. Her phone was recording. Again. The city moved under bright lights and dark corners, and as the pieces aligned, Daniel Fulton remained quiet. But silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Rain tapped gently against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive conference room atop Voss Tower. Inside, 12 board members sat, stiffly around a polished mahogany table, faces tight with unease. Their usual confidence had been replaced by restless glances and hushed murmurs. Cameron Voss entered with practiced swagger, adjusting his silk tie as if nothing had changed. He carried a sleek leather portfolio under his arm, flanked by 2 junior partners who looked more nervous than prepared. His expression betrayed no hint of the chaos he had helped unleash. "Let's make this quick," he said, placing the portfolio on the table. "I propose a strategic transition of equity control over Avalon Holdings and its related subsidiaries. Streamlining the leadership structure gives us flexibility, speed, and modern direction." One of the older board members, a man named Walter Keene, cleared his throat. "And what of Daniel Fulton?" he asked without looking up. Cameron smiled, thin and practiced. "Mr. Fulton hasn't attended a board meeting in over a decade. He's a passive asset. It's time for active capital to lead." Another member, a silver-haired woman in a navy pantsuit, shifted in her chair. "That passive asset executed a system-wide lockdown 2 days ago that froze operations in 4 major cities. Passive, you say?" Before Cameron could respond, the double doors at the back of the room creaked open. Every head turned. Daniel Fulton walked in wearing a dark overcoat and a simple charcoal suit. His presence was effortless. Unhurried, composed, he carried no documents, no aides, just his measured stride and unreadable expression. Cameron froze for a fraction of a second, masking surprise with a quick smirk. "Well," he said, "if it isn't the legend himself. We were just discussing your retirement." Daniel didn't sit. He remained at the end of the table, glancing slowly around the room. "I built this company while cleaning floors in buildings like this," he said. "Not for applause, not for handshakes, but so that one day someone like me wouldn't have to wait for permission to walk through a front door." His voice was calm, each word deliberate. Cameron chuckled. "That's a beautiful speech, but this is a boardroom, not a poetry recital." Daniel's eyes met his. "You don't speak for this room." Vivian entered behind him and placed a single folder on the table. She remained standing beside Daniel, silent. Inside the folder were signed proxies, majority shares consolidated under Fulton Asset Trust, including emergency decision-making privileges transferred back to Daniel weeks earlier, legal, binding, and immediate. Walter Keene picked up the documents, skimmed them, and exhaled through his nose. "He owns controlling interest again," he muttered. "Fully executed." Cameron's face flushed. He leaned forward. "You manipulated. Your way back in?" "No," Daniel interrupted. "I waited. You tried to erase a man whose name you never bothered to learn. You turned the company into a machine that forgot people, communities, integrity. So now I'm here to remind it." Vivian pulled a small device from her coat pocket and placed it on the table. It played audio, Cameron's voice, crystal clear. Strip Fulton's name from all investor-facing documents. We'll bleed his control piece by piece until he's just a ghost in the archive. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then came another recording, Leora's final gift. This one from the rooftop bar. "He's harmless," Cameron had said, laughing. "An old face with no fight left. We'll push him out and rebuild Avalon in our image. White glove, white walls, whiteboard." Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to. The board's expressions shifted. Disgust, shock. A few whispered apologies to no one in particular. Cameron stood, eyes wild now. "This is a setup. You're manufacturing—" "No," Walter cut in. "You disgraced us all." Daniel turned to Vivian. "File the executive removal." She nodded once, then slid the pre-signed papers across the table. Effective immediately, Cameron Voss was stripped of all titles, privileges, and equity voting. Power. Security was already waiting outside. No words were exchanged as they escorted him out. His footsteps echoed down the hallway like the ending of a long, sour performance. Daniel looked around at the stunned faces. "I'm not here to rebuild what he broke," he said. "I'm here to change the direction completely." Vivian tapped her tablet, projecting a new blueprint on the wall behind him. A logo appeared. Ground Up Initiative. A fund designed to empower underserved entrepreneurs, expand equity-based development, and repurpose Avalon assets into community-driven spaces. Transparent, accountable, legacy-minded. One board member stood, then another. No applause, just nods of understanding. Daniel finally took a seat. The room no longer belonged to arrogance, it belonged to purpose. Sunlight broke through the clouds over downtown Austin, casting soft golden streaks across the rooftops. The city, humming. With routine, barely noticed the seismic shift taking place behind polished glass and executive silence. In a renovated former bank building now serving as Avalon Group's new headquarters, Daniel stood before a crowd of journalists, investors, and community leaders. The press conference was invitation only, and every seat was taken. Vivian stood beside him, holding a slim tablet. Leora moved through the room, directing logistics with the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to prove her worth. Nina hovered near the back, scribbling notes for an article she would publish under her full name. No aliases this time. Daniel adjusted the microphone gently. The crowd leaned forward, waiting. "I never wanted cameras," he began. Voice steady. "I wanted progress." He paused, letting the room settle. "I walked into a lobby wearing the same coat I wore when I built this company's foundation. I was dismissed before I was seen. That moment was never personal. It was a reflection of a deeper disease, one many have lived with in silence. No flashbulbs, just breathless stillness. The Ground Up Initiative begins today with $600 million in seed funding. Its mission is to invest in people overlooked by systems that value polish over purpose." He looked around slowly, meeting every eye. "We aren't building alternatives. We're building what should have existed all along." As the audience erupted in applause, Daniel stepped aside. Vivian announced initial partnerships, Nina's writing team pushed digital press kits, and news outlets buzzed with headlines already spreading across the internet. Within the hour, Ground Up trended across major platforms. In a nearby office, Daniel sat with Gloria Tate, a respected economist who had been quietly consulting on the project's architecture. She reviewed final reports while sipping coffee from a ceramic mug bearing the phrase, "Legacy isn't built. It's planted." "You're going to disrupt things," she said, eyes scanning spreadsheets. The quiet kind of disruption. The kind no one can stop once it begins. That's the idea, Daniel replied, watching the city from the window. Traffic moved below. Buses carried students. Trucks unloaded bakery goods. People lived, unaware that something long overdue was unfolding above them. Elsewhere, in a corporate tower previously owned by Avalon Holdings, workers dismantled the old nameplate from the lobby wall. A new plaque was being installed, sleek, clean, bearing only a single phrase, "Welcome to the Commons." The building would reopen as a shared hub for startups, nonprofits, and education spaces. Rent would be affordable. Equity options would be offered to those working within. No security barriers would separate offices from opportunity. Meanwhile, former investors scrambled. Cameron Voss's name had been removed from the registry of approved board members across 3 states. His personal accounts were frozen under ethics review. He was last seen boarding a private jet bound for Zurich with no press statement. Inside Ground-Up's media room, Nina published her article, "The Man They Refused to See." It began with the sentence, "They called him invisible, but he was the foundation under their feet." Within an hour, 3 national papers picked it up. Her inbox flooded with messages, editors offering positions, students thanking her, hotel staff from other states sharing similar stories. Leora received an encrypted message from a former Avalon executive now eager to testify in a federal probe examining racial bias in real estate investment practices. She forwarded it to legal without hesitation. Daniel remained quiet throughout the commotion. Later that night, in the modest home he had never moved out of, he stood in the same living room where he had once written ideas in notebooks by candlelight. The fire was lit again, the journal open on the table beside him. He added a final line beneath the entry from days earlier. "We did not knock on their doors. We built our own, and opened them wide." He set the pen down. Vivian arrived just before midnight, holding a small wooden box. Inside were relics from his first business, the original company seal, the mop handle from the janitorial closet he once managed, and a faded receipt showing his first stock purchase, 10 shares at $4.75 each. "We're archiving these," she said, "for the museum exhibit they're planning next year." Daniel smiled faintly. "Let them tell the story, if they'll tell it right." "They will now," she replied. He looked out the window. Lights shimmered across the skyline. Somewhere in the distance, a train rolled by. Familiar, steady. Everything felt different, yet nothing had changed. And that was the point. He didn't want celebration. He wanted impact. And now, finally, he had both.